Welcome to Florida's Cannabis News Podcast, a weekly podcast exploring the legal, political, and economic changes to Florida's cannabis industry, covering important news and events for Florida cannabis businesses and professionals. Sit back and relax. Florida's Cannabis News Podcast begins now.
Good morning and happy Friday. Today is April 26, 2019, and you're tuned into Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. This is your host, David, and I'm here every Friday covering the latest news and events in Florida's cannabis industry. Today we have a light episode, so let's dive right into this week's top story. This week's top story is reported by Derek Ham of the News Service of Florida, where state health officials are preparing to revamp the application process for medical cannabis licenses. Now, last week we discussed how Governor DeSantis planned to roll out 8 more licenses, which arose out of litigation proceedings that have been going on since the low THC days. His decision last week came out of a joint settlement agreement between the Department of Health and 8 applicants who applied for licenses under the original Florida medical cannabis program, the low THC law, in 2014. Basically, Florida Cannabis 1.0. And these applicants were never awarded licenses. We went through a nice breakdown of Florida's medical cannabis program in last week's episode, so I recommend listening to that. DeSantis added to the momentum this week because he's taking another approach to revamp Florida's cannabis market. In addition to adding the 8 licenses last week, Governor DeSantis plans on rolling out a new application program to get a medical cannabis license. It appears little by little, Governor DeSantis is fixing problems Rick Scott created by rolling out a super limited cannabis program in special session in 2017. The 2017 law that Rick Scott implemented gave us regulations like the mandatory vertical integration and the smoking ban. DeSantis undid the smoking ban and is expanding the Florida market by issuing this new application process. And under his leadership, we will see edibles come online this year, and our industrial hemp program will also be born this year as well. Time and time again, Governor DeSantis is proving he's different than his predecessor, Rick Scott. Even though they're both Republicans, it's clear at this point DeSantis sees the value in the cannabis industry, and he's willing to change it. So last week we mentioned 22 licenses have been issued by the Department of Health, and there's 3 licenses left. Based on the June 2017 regulations that created the current market we have today, one of the licenses are reserved for a minority applicant. This special priority arose out of a case, Pigford v. Glickman, which was a federal class action lawsuit from 1999. This was a lawsuit against the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, alleging racial discrimination against African American farmers and its allocation of farm loans and assistance between the 80s and early 90s. With pressure on small family farms throughout the 20th century, both white and African American farmers were struggling to survive in the South, and the USDA made its loans dependent on the applicant's credit, but African Americans were discriminated against and had difficulty gaining credit. So what happened was black farmers who filed suit in the Pigford case had all been subjected to racial discrimination by USDA officials. The denial of credit and benefits to black farmers and the preferential treatment of white farmers by the USDA essentially forced black farmers out of agriculture throughout the 20th century, out of the agriculture industry. African American farms were foreclosed on more frequently than white farms, and African American farmers were subject to humiliation and degradation by USDA county officials. So, in 1997, Timothy Pigford filed a lawsuit and was joined by 400 African American farmer plaintiffs. And in 1999, the lawsuit settled and essentially built a 2-track dispute resolution mechanism for those seeking relief under the Pigford case. The most widely used option was called Track A, which provides a monetary settlement of $50,000 plus relief in the form of a loan forgiveness to offset any tax liability. To date, almost $1 billion have been paid out or credited to more than 13,000 farmers under the settlement's consent decree, and this settlement is reportedly the largest civil rights settlement to date. So following this case, Florida lawmakers created a class of special privilege applicants to obtain an MMTC license. In addition to the 1 license reserved for a Pigford applicant, the 2017 law gave preference to applicants who owned facilities used to process citrus fruits. Specifically, 2 licenses are supposed to go to citrus farmers. So up until this point, the Department of Health still has not issued a license to a member of the Pigford class, nor have they issued those 2 licenses to applicants who own or operate a citrus facility. Now, there's a lawsuit right now currently pending called the Florida case that argues that the legislator implementing specified classes and demanding vertical integration is unconstitutional. So in January of 2017, Florida was part of that second round of applicants that I mentioned in last week's episode, and the Department of Health started denying applications at the end of January 2017. Subsequently, Florida was denied a license and sued the Department of Health. They had everything they needed, but the department denied it. After the department denied it, they sought an administrative hearing, which was also denied, and the health department told them, once we get our regulations set up by June, foreshadowing the special session, Florida, you'll be able to seek relief in the courts. So, special session comes around in June of 2017. The lawmakers implement the rules. The rules direct the Department of Health to license 10 more MMTCs, with those 2 exceptions for the Pigford class and the 2 citrus farmers, and Florida never got their license. Florida is essentially arguing in their lawsuit that the application process that the state set up is unfair to any other company that applied since the amendment passed in 2016, talking about Amendment 2. Florida is essentially saying that the state is picking favorites because they're setting up multiple classes of applicants. So Florida is arguing that the laws in that special session that were made are unconstitutional. Not only are they arguing that the application process is flawed, but they're also arguing that the requirement of vertical integration by the state is also flawed. Florida is relying on the Florida Constitution that says there shall be no special law or general law of local application pertaining to private incorporation or grant of privilege to a private corporation. Now what the courts are going to have to do is compare the law Rick Scott implemented to our Constitution and see if the statute is constitutional. So fast forward to 2018, Circuit Court Judge in Leon County, Judge Dodson, got the case, the Florida case, and ruled that the statute that Rick Scott implemented was in fact unconstitutional. So Judge Dodson issued a temporary injunction, which is essentially an order requiring state officials to register Florida and other medical cannabis firms to legally participate in the business. He basically said, Health Department, you have to start registering these MMTCs. Obviously, the Department of Health appealed, triggering an automatic stay. Later on in fall of 2018, Judge Dodson not only refused to stay his order, but he scheduled a December 5th hearing to allow other firms to join Florida-grown suit. So we're waiting for the First District Court of Appeals of Florida to hear the case. Up until then, we're sitting in limbo. Florida-grown CEO Adam Elan said no settlement agreement has been reached in this case, but Governor DeSantis' office is urging that the state settle the case and essentially drop it. So that brings us to the current state of the law, but last week DeSantis issued 8 more licenses, bringing us to a total of 22. But 4 more are looming on the horizon because the way the 2017 law is set up, under the law, the state is required to issue 4 more licenses every time 100,000 patients register to become a medical cannabis patient in Florida. If you're a weekly listener, you know we gain roughly 2,500 to 3,000 patients a week, and right now we're sitting at around 212,000 patients. We're looking at really a 12,000 patient increase every month, and at this rate, we could see the 4 more licenses be unlocked by October or November. So DeSantis this week is hinting at a new application process. Hundreds of potential operators are expected to apply under the new application process, but this is how it's going to work. They're laying out 2 tracks. One track for the Pigford farmer license that we broke down before, and another for the 2 licenses that take into consideration the citrus preference. And then they're going to distribute the 4 licenses probably in October or November whenever we hit 300,000 patients. Florida has the potential to be one of the nation's top medical cannabis markets, and Governor Ron DeSantis is about to open up the market a little bit more. I think by Thanksgiving, we could see about 30 vertically integrated operators in the state of Florida with no cap on the number of dispensaries they could open. But right now, the way Florida's market is set up, you need a lot of capital to get into the market. The barrier to entry is tremendous. To get one of these licenses from a third party, you're going to have to pay around $40 to $60 million. This obviously leaves no room for mom and pop shops or boutique dispensaries or cultivators to carve out a spot in Florida's cannabis industry. Let's compare Florida to another state, California, just to show you how interesting the state setups can be. California, they've issued 3,000 cultivation permits. They require no vertical integration, and retail license fees are $3,500. In Florida, the licensing fee is around $60,000. Not only do you need to pay the state $60,000 if you want to submit an application, you need to post a $5 million performance bond as well. So just compare that. California, no vertical integration. That means that if you want to be just a cultivator, you could apply for just a cultivator license. If you want to just distribute, you could just apply for a distribution license. It's interesting seeing the price between the $60,000 in Florida and the $3,500 in California because, remember, the Florida licenses, once you get one, you get everything because of the vertical integration. So someone could argue it's justified. So for example, in California, if you wanted the retail license, if you wanted the cultivation license, all of those things could really add up to $60,000. But $60,000 is still high. What's really cool in California is that one person could hold more than one license. So here, one entity could only have one license in Florida. So for example, TrueLeave could not hold two MMTC licenses. But in California, that's allowed. So what cultivators do in California is they stack multiple licenses on top of each other to create bigger operations. Now in California, there's 3 regulators that are each responsible for different parts of the cannabis industry. You have the Department of Food and Agriculture, which regulates cultivators and has issued the most licenses out of any of the agencies. You have the Bureau of Cannabis Control. Now, this agency regulates retailers, testing labs, distributors, micro businesses, and delivery. They've issued around a quarter of the licenses. And the last agency in California is the Department of Public Health, which has issued around 12% of the licenses to manufacturers. Now, in Florida, we only have the Department of Health. So I'm just trying to paint the picture for you for how advanced some of these states are in terms of the regulations and licensing application setups. Not only that, there's around 10 types of cannabis licenses you could apply for in California. Even the simple cultivation license itself breaks down into small cultivation license, specialty cultivation license, and outdoor cultivation license. It's fun to imagine Florida one day being like this. We could see the day. Now, could we see DeSantis lift the state-implemented vertical integration setup? I think he's going to because he's urging the state to settle with Florida-grown. He cleaned up the smoking ban last month. The momentum is saying yes. The governor's office this week came out and said that they expect the state to drop its appeal in the citrus case, the Florida-grown case, and allow the application process to move forward. The legislature by itself would never have resolved the smoking ban if it was not for Governor Ron DeSantis. But because MMTCs are now allowed to sell whole flower and edibles are probably coming up this summer, this is going to undoubtedly lead to an increase in patients, which is all the more reason why we need to issue new licenses as soon as possible to get supply out there. I'm patiently waiting on Governor Ron DeSantis' other major issues in the whole cannabis space, but it's looking good so far. So as I mentioned, this week is a light week for cannabis news in Florida. My goal with this podcast is to provide you value. And I think that giving you puffery stories or really things that aren't stories isn't what you're here to listen for. And yeah, that was really the only news of the week. But let's see what's on the horizon. So Ray Rodriguez's bill to limit THC levels to 10% is scheduled for a second reading in the House. Usually from the House, bills usually go from there to special order. But it's been pretty quiet around this bill. Maybe it's slowly dying. I'm not sure. I haven't got any word on it. But there's no companion bill filed in the Senate yet, so maybe lawmakers got the picture from advocates this past couple weeks about the THC limit. We'll see. We should get word on SB 1020 sometime this weekend maybe, or next week. That is about industrial hemp. So yeah, thanks for listening this week. Remember, we do have all of our news we cover here on the podcast, linked to our Twitter account, _FL Cannabis News. So follow us there to join the conversation throughout the week, get updates and analysis. This week's weekly patient count from Florida's Office of Medical Marijuana Use brings us to 210,561 qualified patients, 90,000 away from 300K. As usual, I will have the office's link to their live updates published in the show notes below, so click on over to that link to see the new update. That's our top stories of the week. Let's move into upcoming events. This Sunday, April 28th, starting at noon, Green Carpet Networking Events is hosting another awesome event in Bradenton. If you're in the Bradenton area, they will be having a Green Carpet Networking event at O'Brick's Irish Pub and Martini Bar, 427 12th Street West. As you know, marijuana is fast becoming legal around the world, including right here in Florida. So this is a nice opportunity for anyone who ever wanted to work in the cannabis space or learn about cannabis. At this week's event, you'll learn directly from industry leaders with everything from the changing laws that we talk about here on the podcast every week to new career opportunities on the horizon. More importantly, you'll connect with other cannabis professionals and entrepreneurs in the area. So go on and check it out, have some food and drinks, and catch up with your local cannabis community. Tickets will be $50 as usual for the Green Carpet Networking events. Check it out. Also, this Sunday, April 28th, Lift the Band Tour presented by True Leave is coming to Jupiter. Lift the Band Tour is essentially a group of educators who go around the state to cities who have banned cannabis. This Sunday, they'll be in Jupiter at Das Beer Garden from 12:30 to 4. They're going to have discussions from a number of people, lawmakers potentially, or officials in the industry. These Lift the Band tours are educational events where you go, you network for an hour. There's a panel usually where there's a Q&A session after and more networking. I'll have the link below in the show notes. That's it for Florida's top cannabis news and events. If you have any stories or events you want to share, head on over to our Twitter account _FL_Cannabis News or email us at floridacannabisnewspodcast@gmail.com. And review us 5 stars on iTunes or either podcast app you listen on. Share with your friends who are interested in the cannabis industry. Thank you so much for staying up to date with Florida's cannabis industry. I'll be back again with you next Friday for another news-filled episode of Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. Have a great weekend.